A wealthy businessman, a seductive influencer, and a love-struck driver, a deadly triangle of passion, betrayal, and murder that shattered Ohio's elite. What appeared to be a life of luxury and perfection was hiding dark secrets that would lead to a tragic end no one could have imagined. This story explores the devastating consequences of unchecked desires and how betrayal can unravel even the most carefully curated lives, leaving destruction in its wake. Before we unravel this shocking tale of lust, deceit, and murder, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more stories that delve into humanity's darkest secrets. Marcus Hale, 45, was the epitome of success, an influential Ohio businessman who had built an empire through decades of ruthless determination. With his towering stature, sharp suits, and commanding presence, Marcus exuded power and authority. Beside him stood his wife, Sienna Hale, 28, a glamorous influencer whose captivating beauty and effortless charm had won her millions of followers. With her flawless caramel skin, striking hazel eyes, and a figure that could stop traffic, Sienna was adored by the public as a social media darling. Together, they appeared to be the perfect power couple, living a life of opulence in their sprawling suburban mansion. Their home was a palace of luxury, filled with designer furnishings, glittering chandeliers, and high-end cars parked in the garage. But behind the picture-perfect facade, their relationship was far from ideal. Marcus's controlling tendencies began to cast a shadow over Sienna's glamorous life. While he lavished her with expensive gifts and public adoration, behind closed doors, he scrutinized her every move, dictating her social circle, her career decisions, and even her wardrobe. Darius Cole, 30, their driver. Standing at 6 feet 3 inches with dark chocolate skin, a perfectly chiseled physique, blinding abs, and soft, full lips, Darius looked like he had walked straight out of a fitness magazine. His piercing gaze and deep voice added an air of mystery to his otherwise humble demeanor. Darius wasn't just a driver, he was a man with quiet ambition, secretly studying business on the side, while working tirelessly to support his family back home. It didn't take long for Sienna to notice him. At first, it was harmless, playful smiles exchanged in the rearview mirror, light banter during long drives. But for Darius, those moments were electric. Sienna, with her effortless beauty and intoxicating charm, was unlike anyone he had ever known. Meanwhile, Sienna's growing frustration with Marcus fueled her desire for rebellion. She felt trapped in a golden cage, suffocated by the endless rules and expectations. Marcus's absence from their home, driven by his constant work trips and late-night meetings, only made things worse. One evening, as Darius chauffeured Sienna to a lavish influencer event, she leaned forward in the car, her cleavage prominently on display, and asked him a simple question: "Do you think I look good tonight?" Her tone was teasing, her smile alluring. Through the mirror, Darius caught her gaze, his pulse quickening. "You look stunning, Mrs. Hale," he replied, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. Sienna laughed softly, her lips curving into a mischievous smile. She knew exactly what she was doing. From that moment, their dynamic shifted. What began as stolen glances and subtle flirtation soon escalated into something far more dangerous. As the weeks passed, Marcus grew increasingly suspicious. Sienna seemed more distant, her phone constantly in her hand as she giggled at texts. She often insisted on Darius driving her places, even when other drivers were available. Though Marcus didn't say anything at first, his sharp instincts told him something was amiss. The perfect facade of the Hale household was beginning to crack, and beneath it lay the seeds of betrayal that would soon grow into a storm of passion, deceit, and murder. Sienna Hale was a woman who thrived on control, even when it came masked as rebellion. After her initial playful exchange with Darius in the car, she began to push the boundaries further. It started innocently enough, longer than necessary glances in the rearview mirror, the occasional brush of her fingers as she handed him her phone, and her melodious laughter that seemed to echo in the small confines of the vehicle. One evening, after a particularly lavish gala, Sienna took her seduction up a notch. Draped in a sleek black gown that hugged her curves, she leaned forward in the car, the deep neckline of her dress leaving little to the imagination. "Darius," she said, her voice low and smooth, "it's such a long drive home. Don't you ever get tired of driving me around?" Darius glanced at her through the mirror, his dark brown eyes catching hers. "Not at all, Mrs. Hale. It's my job to make sure you're safe." Her lips curled into a sly smile. "Safe. That's such a strong word. What about happy?" From that night on, Sienna became relentless. She began inventing reasons to ride alone with Darius. She would ask him to take the long route home, just so they could spend more time together. When she caught him stealing glances at her through the mirror, she would meet his gaze, holding it just long enough to send a silent message. The first time they crossed the line, it was in the garage of the Hale mansion. After another late-night drive, Sienna lingered as Darius held the car door open for her. She stood close, her perfume intoxicating, her eyes locked onto his. "Thank you, Darius," she whispered, her voice laced with something far more intimate than gratitude. Before he could step back, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a bold, deliberate kiss. Darius froze, his heart pounding as she pulled away, her face unreadable. "Good night," she said softly, disappearing into the house, leaving him reeling. That kiss ignited a flame neither of them could extinguish. Their stolen moments escalated quickly. In the car, Sienna would slide her hand along Darius's thigh as he drove, her touch lingering just long enough to leave him breathless. One afternoon, while Marcus was away on a business trip, Sienna invited Darius into the house under the guise of needing help with groceries. As soon as the door closed behind him, she pulled him into the kitchen, her lips crashing into his. Darius tried to resist at first, knowing the stakes, but her touch was intoxicating. Before he knew it, they were in her bedroom, Marcus's bedroom, where Sienna's calculated seduction left him powerless to her charms. For Darius, it was love. He saw Sienna as a goddess trapped in a gilded cage, a woman who needed his protection and affection. He whispered promises to her in the dead of night, vowing to always be there for her, no matter what. But for Sienna, it was something entirely different. To her, the affair was a game, a thrilling escape from the monotony of her life with Marcus. While Darius dreamed of a future together, Sienna laughed inwardly at the idea. As much as she enjoyed their passionate escapades, she knew Darius could never offer her the wealth and power that Marcus did. To her, this was all just a fleeting distraction. Meanwhile, Marcus's suspicions grew. He noticed how often Sienna requested Darius as her driver, even when other staff members were available. She began leaving the house at odd hours, citing vague errands or last-minute influencer meetings. And when she was home, her phone was always in her hand, her giggles filling the air. One evening, as Marcus returned early from a business trip, he saw Sienna and Darius in the driveway. She was leaning casually against the car, laughing at something Darius had said, her hand briefly brushing his arm. Though the interaction seemed innocent enough, it struck a nerve in Marcus. He had built his fortune on reading people, and something about the way they looked at each other sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Marcus decided to start keeping a closer eye on his wife. Little did Sienna and Darius know, the walls of the Hale mansion had ears and Marcus was about to uncover their darkest secret. Marcus Hale was no fool. His success as a businessman had come from his sharp instincts, and those same instincts told him that something wasn't right in his home. Sienna's sudden penchant for late-night errands and her constant requests for Darius to accompany her were not lost on him. Her giggles as she typed away on her phone, the way she avoided eye contact when he asked about her day, all of it added up to something he couldn't ignore. One evening, as Sienna breezed past him on her way out, claiming she needed Darius to drive her to a last-minute collaboration meeting, Marcus's patience ran thin. He nodded silently, kissed her cheek, and watched her leave. As soon as the door closed behind her, he picked up the phone and made a call to a private security company. By the next morning, his house was outfitted with discreet hidden cameras, covering all the main areas, including the bedroom he shared with Sienna. At first, Marcus hoped he was wrong, that his suspicions were the result of his own insecurities. But as the days turned into weeks, the footage painted a different picture. It started small, lingering touches as Sienna handed Darius her purse in the foyer, flirtatious laughter as they stood too close in the kitchen, her hand brushing his arm in the garage. But then, one evening, Marcus reviewed footage that left no doubt. The scene unfolded in their bedroom, a space Marcus once considered sacred. Sienna had called Darius up under the pretense of helping her move some boxes. But as soon as he stepped into the room, she shut the door behind him, a coy smile playing on her lips. "Why do you always look so nervous when you're with me?" she teased, stepping closer to him. Darius tried to maintain his composure. "Because I know I shouldn't be here," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And yet, here you are," Sienna replied, her fingers trailing up his chest, lingering over his shirt buttons. Darius hesitated for a moment, but when she leaned in and pressed her lips to his resolve crumbled. He pulled her close, his hands roaming her back as the kiss deepened. The footage showed them moving to the bed, Marcus's bed. The camera captured every detail, the way Sienna unbuttoned Darius's shirt, revealing his chiseled abs, the way she pulled him down onto the sheets, her laughter mixing with his groans of pleasure. They seemed oblivious to the world around them, completely lost in their passion. Marcus's grip on the tablet tightened as he watched. His face burned with anger and humiliation. The very thought of Darius, his trusted driver, defiling the sanctity of his marriage bed with his wife was enough to make his blood boil. But what hurt even more was Sienna's expression. She wasn't just engaging in a thoughtless fling. The way she looked at Darius, the way she laughed and touched him, it was as if she was mocking Marcus, daring him to find out. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Instead, he watched the footage over and over, each replay fueling his rage. By morning, he had made up his mind. He would confront them both, and there would be no room for forgiveness. Marcus Hale could no longer contain his fury. The betrayal was too deep, the humiliation too unbearable. Armed with the damning footage of Sienna and Darius, he waited for her to return home that evening, his anger simmering just below the surface. Sienna entered the house, oblivious to the storm brewing. She greeted Marcus with her usual breezy charm, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood in the living room, the tablet in his hand, his jaw clenched tightly. "Sit down," Marcus said, his tone icy. Sienna raised an eyebrow, but she complied, sensing something was off. "What's this about?" she asked, feigning innocence. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he pressed play on the tablet and turned it toward her. The footage began to roll, her and Darius in their bedroom, laughing, kissing, and tangled in the sheets. Sienna's face turned pale, but she quickly composed herself. "So you've been spying on me now?" she shot back, trying to regain control of the situation. "Don't you dare turn this on me!" Marcus roared, his voice shaking with rage. "How long, Sienna? How long have you been making a fool out of me in my own house?" Sienna crossed her arms defiantly. "What did you expect, Marcus? You're never here. You treat me like a trophy to parade around, but you don't see me. Darius does. He listens to me. Don't you say his name." Marcus bellowed, slamming the tablet onto the coffee table. Sienna stood, her anger matching his. "Maybe if you were half the man he is, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." That was the breaking point. Marcus's vision blurred with rage. He lunged at Sienna, his hands wrapping around her neck. She fought back, clawing at his arms, but his grip tightened as years of suppressed anger and betrayal erupted. "You ruined everything." Marcus screamed as her struggles weakened. "You made me a joke. Within moments, Sienna went limp in his grasp, her lifeless body slumping to the floor. The room was eerily silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. He stumbled back, staring at what he had done. His rage quickly turned to fear and regret. "What have I done?" he muttered, his hands trembling. Marcus's mind raced as he stared at Sienna's lifeless body sprawled across the living room floor. Panic set in, and his thoughts spiraled between regret and self-preservation. He reached for his phone and dialed Darius, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Get to the house. Now," Marcus ordered, his tone leaving no room for questions. When Darius arrived, his heart sank at the sight before him. Sienna's body lay motionless, her once vibrant presence extinguished. "What happened?" Darius asked, his voice trembling. "She's dead," Marcus said bluntly. "She pushed me too far, and he stopped himself, running a hand over his face. "It doesn't matter. What matters is cleaning this up." "What do you mean, clean this up?" Darius asked, his voice rising. "I mean, you're going to help me dispose of the body," Marcus snapped, glaring at him. "You owe me that much after everything I've done for you." Darius froze, torn between the man who had employed him and the woman he had fallen deeply in love with. His emotions swirled, grief for Sienna, fury at Marcus, and fear of what this could mean for him. "I need to clear my head," Marcus said abruptly. "Figure out our next move. When I get back, this needs to be handled." Without waiting for a response, Marcus stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound of his car roaring to life signaled his departure. Darius stood alone in the living room, staring down at Sienna. His chest tightened with grief as memories of their stolen moments together flooded his mind. The laughter, the passion, the promises, everything was gone, stolen by Marcus's uncontrollable rage. But Darius's love for Sienna was stronger than his fear of Marcus. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. With trembling hands, Darius pulled out his phone. His heart pounded as he dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's been a murder," Darius said, his voice shaky but resolute. "The victim is Sienna Hale. Her husband, Marcus Hale, he killed her." The dispatcher asked for details, but Darius could barely hear them over the sound of his pounding heart. He stayed on the line, providing the information they needed, knowing full well the consequences. As Darius hung up the phone, the sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. His love for Sienna had outweighed his loyalty to Marcus, and he knew there was no turning back. As the sirens wailed outside, Darius stood frozen in the living room, anxiety and fear gripping him. The police had arrived, and though he knew the truth, he was unsure of what would happen next. His entire world had just flipped upside down. Moments later, Detective Naomi Perez stepped into the house, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts. Her cool, composed demeanor contrasted with the intense atmosphere of the scene. As she stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanned the room for any immediate clues. "Where is she?" Perez asked firmly, her voice steady, as she looked toward Darius. Darius, his voice shaking, nodded toward the living room. "She's in there, it's over." The officers swiftly followed Darius's direction, moving cautiously as they entered the house where Sienna's lifeless body lay on the floor. The brutality of the scene was evident, her murder had been cold and deliberate. Detective Perez looked around, taking in the details of the room. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal. Perez turned to Darius, her eyes narrowing. "What happened here?" "I didn't do it," Darius said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus killed her. I tried to stop it, but it was too late." His words tumbled out in a rush as the weight of the situation hit him. Perez's gaze flickered as she processed his words. "Where's Marcus now?" I don't know. He left after it happened, Darius said, his hands trembling at his sides. The officers began their search, gathering evidence from around the house. Detective Perez, however, kept her focus on Darius, watching him closely. There was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right. But before she could question him further, an officer returned with a tablet in hand. I found this, the officer said, holding it out for Perez. Perez took the device and powered it up, her mind already turning. As the tablet booted up, her eyes quickly scanned through the contents. At first, the footage seemed innocuous, but then she came across something that made her stop. The footage from the hidden cameras in the house appeared on the screen. It was from one of the cameras in the master bedroom. Her heart sank as she recognized the figures in the footage. It was Sienna, and Darius was with her. The scene unfolded in real time, with Darius and Sienna on the bed, their movements slow and intimate, a clear indication of the affair that had been hidden for so long. Perez's face grew tense as she watched the footage, the implication of what she was seeing sinking in. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was something deeper. This was about betrayal, about control. As she continued to watch, the footage grew increasingly incriminating, and her stomach churned at the realization that this affair was at the heart of what had driven Marcus to murder his wife. She turned to one of the officers. "Get the footage from the other cameras. I want to see everything, especially from that night." The officer nodded and moved quickly to retrieve additional files, realizing that what they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Perez stayed glued to the screen as she replayed the footage, the intimate moments between Darius and Sienna confirming the affair that Marcus had suspected all along. "Get all of it," Perez said again, her tone now more urgent. "I need every bit of footage we can get. This footage is enough to show Marcus's motive, but I need the rest to tie everything together." As more footage came through, Perez's eyes narrowed. The more she watched, the more it became clear that Marcus had been monitoring everything, his wife's affair, their secret moments in the bedroom, the moments of intimacy that led to his wrath. When Marcus had confronted Sienna earlier, it was clear from the footage that the argument had escalated. Perez watched in horror as Marcus's rage consumed him, his hands tightening around his wife's neck. The cameras caught everything, Marcus's hands squeezing the life out of Sienna in a fit of jealousy and fury. As the footage continued, Perez knew they had everything they needed. Marcus had been caught in the act, his crime exposed not just by his actions, but by his own obsession with controlling every aspect of his wife's life. The cameras, which he had set up to monitor his house, had betrayed him. Perez turned to Darius, her voice steady but firm. "You need to tell me everything. Now." Darius, his face pale, nodded. "Marcus killed her. I couldn't stop it. I wanted to, but I couldn't." "Where is he now?" Perez asked. "I don't know," Darius whispered, shaking his head. "He left after it happened." Minutes later, Marcus was located and arrested. The police found him in his car, trying to clear his head. He offered no resistance when the officers placed him in cuffs. The evidence was clear, the cameras had caught everything. As he sat in the interrogation room, Marcus remained eerily calm. Detective Perez stepped in, her eyes hard. "You're under arrest for the murder of your wife, Sienna Hale." Marcus didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. The footage had proven everything, his crime, his obsession, his betrayal. The cameras had exposed Marcus's darkest secrets, and now the consequences would come crashing down around him. The trial of Marcus Hale was unlike anything Ohio had seen in years. What began as a high-profile case of infidelity quickly spiraled into a media frenzy as every detail of Marcus's crime, and the affair between his wife, Sienna, and the family driver, Darius, became public knowledge. The footage from the hidden cameras, captured in intimate detail, was played repeatedly in the courtroom, and soon it was being aired on every news outlet across the country. The video of Sienna and Darius on their bed, once a private moment, was now a symbol of betrayal, magnifying the scandal that would forever mark Marcus's life. The prosecution presented a compelling case, showing how Marcus's obsessive need for control over his wife and the growing tension in their marriage had ultimately led to his violent outburst. The footage of Sienna and Darius was the centerpiece of their argument, providing irrefutable proof of the affair. The prosecution argued that it was Marcus's jealousy and his desperate need to maintain power that had driven him to murder, and they stressed that the brutality of the crime, strangling his wife in cold blood, demonstrated the extent of his rage. Marcus, however, maintained a stoic and emotionless demeanor throughout the trial. In his testimony, he tried to justify his actions, claiming that he had been pushed to the brink by his wife's betrayal. "She humiliated me," he told the court. "I gave her everything, wealth, status, power, and she threw it all away for a man who could never give her what I could. What else was I supposed to do?" His words only fueled public outrage, as many saw him not as a victim of infidelity, but as a man who had lost control and taken the life of his wife out of spite and ego. Throughout the proceedings, Marcus showed no remorse, no regret. Even when confronted with the images of his wife's lifeless body, lying in their living room, he remained unmoved. It was clear that he viewed himself as a man wronged, not as a murderer. But the jury saw things differently. They deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The crime had been premeditated, they concluded, and Marcus's actions were driven by jealousy and a need for control over his wife. As the judge read the verdict, Marcus sat motionless, the weight of his fate finally settling on him. The sentence was swift and severe: 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For Marcus, it was a life sentence, one that would forever strip him of his wealth and his freedom. His once thriving business empire began to crumble in the aftermath of the trial, as clients and partners distanced themselves from him. The scandal had tarnished everything he had built, and he was left to rot in prison, his name forever associated with the brutal murder of his wife. While Marcus faced the consequences of his actions, Darius was left to grapple with his own complicated emotions. Despite not being charged with any crime, Darius was ostracized by society. His relationship with Sienna, though consensual, was considered an act of betrayal in the eyes of many, and he was cast aside by friends and acquaintances alike. Even though he had not participated in the murder, his involvement in the affair with Marcus's wife was enough to ruin his reputation. Darius's deep love for Sienna, though misguided, had blinded him to the reality of the situation. He had believed that their affair could lead to something more, that Sienna truly cared for him. But in the end, he was just another pawn in a tragic love triangle. The fallout from the trial left him broken and isolated, without a clear path forward. His loyalty to Sienna had led him down a dangerous path, and now, with her death, he had no place to go. As for Sienna's family, they were left to mourn the loss of a daughter and a sister, though their grief was mixed with anger. Many of them were appalled by her infidelity, but they were even more horrified by the brutal way she had been killed. Her legacy was now forever tied to a scandal, and her own actions, her betrayal of Marcus and her role in the affair, were under constant scrutiny. It was a tragedy all around, one that left no one untouched. The media's obsession with the case did not die down after the verdict. In fact, it only intensified. Talk shows and documentaries continued to discuss the affair, the murder, and the aftermath, providing endless fodder for public consumption. People were fascinated by the layers of betrayal and tragedy, by how love and lust had led to such a violent and senseless end. The trial had come to an end, but the damage had already been done. The tragic consequences of Marcus's actions, combined with Sienna's infidelity, would continue to haunt everyone involved. This story is a grim reminder of how the destructive forces of betrayal, unchecked emotions, and toxic power dynamics can lead to devastating consequences, leaving everyone involved broken and forever scarred. What began as an affair in the shadows ended in a violent tragedy that unraveled lives and exposed the fragility of trust and loyalty. Could Marcus's actions ever be justified, or is there no excuse for betrayal, no matter how deeply it cuts? If this jaw-dropping story left you speechless, like and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more true crime tales that explore the darkest corners of human behavior.